All right, Alexander, we have elections in Sweden. Big elections in Sweden. And what a result that we have. And this is probably not going to be cleared up for a couple of days. They're going to have to count every single vote, it seems. But at first, it looked like the ruling coalition, the ruling government, was on its way to squeak out a victory. But then came I don't want to say surge, but then came a comeback in a way from the coalition, the conservative coalition, the coalition on the right. So it looked like the current incumbent, Magdalena Andersson, and her coalition, her party was set to win. And then as more votes were counted, the coalition led by Jimmy Åkesson, but he's not. If they do win, which is interesting, if they do pull it out, the conservative bloc, he wouldn't. Most likely, he would not be the prime minister. It would probably be someone like Ulf Kristersson. But what an interesting development! It's really going down to the wire. And at first, everyone was thinking they're going to pull it off. Magdalena Andersson's going to pull it off, and now we're having the trajectory looking more towards in favor of Åkesson and Kristersson and their coalition. How do you see things?
I think
and this is big, by the way. If this happens, if the change happens, it's big.
Absolutely, it is very big. And one of the things that makes it particularly big is, of course, the enormous surge there's been for the Swedish Democrats, who are a right-wing party in Sweden. Now, I mean, Sweden has operated since the 1930s within a very strong social democratic consensus. I have to be careful what I say here, because if you're talking about the kind of social democracy that Sweden was in the 1960s, when the famous Swedish Social Democrat Prime Minister Tage Erlander was in charge, well, that has been diluted out of existence ever since then. But the Swedish Social Democratic Party has remained the dominant political force in Swedish society. Now, it's gradually evolved ever closer towards being a sort of Clintonian left-wing party, very different from the kind of party that it was in Erlander's day. But anyway, that's what it is. And it's operated within a society which is in some way, very, very progressivist. I mean, if you bear in mind, the left has dominated Sweden in one form or another since the 1930s. That tells you how, strong, if you like, progressivism, socialism, social democracy has been in Sweden. Now, what you have had intervals of conservative governments in Sweden before. They've tended to be fairly short. And these conservative governments have never really challenged the Social Democrats head on. I mean, they've pursued more free market policies, but they've never posed a significant, if you like, intellectual, ideological challenge to the dominance of the Social Democrats. The Swedish Democrats are completely different from those parties. They do not come from within the Swedish establishment. They are a completely different thing. I mean, some of them were very far right. I mean, they've modified, they've changed their positions, but they are a very strong anti-immigrant right-wing party, and they've won a fifth of the vote in Sweden. And this has been their breakthrough, and they're now the second biggest party in these elections in Sweden. And, they're 10%, they're 10 points behind the Social Democrats, but they're growing, and they have been growing a lot. And who knows, they might continue to. So this is a massive watershed change within Sweden and within Swedish society. It shows a very big swing to the right of a kind that we've never seen before, at least amongst the Swedish electorate.
What happens if the Sweden Democrats manage to squeak this one out? What does
Yeah.
this mean for Sweden internally? But as we discuss geopolitics on this channel, what does this mean for Sweden as looking outwards, and
Yeah.
perhaps outwards looking in as well?
Yeah.
Does this change? Do you see any policy really changing if the Sweden Democrats pull this one out? It's the Sweden Democrats, and then you have the Social Democrats. So
Yes.
very similar in the naming. I just want to point that out for everyone that's listening,
Yeah.
that's not familiar with politics in Sweden. The names are very close. The Sweden Democrats are the Akison and the conservative right, and
Yeah.
the incumbent are the Social Democrats.
If the
So what does it mean if they squeak
Yeah.
this one out?
if the Sweden Democrats get on top of things and are able to form a government in coalition with the other parties, and by the way, they're unlikely to be the party that nominates the prime minister of this government, and that already puts question marks over this government. But at the very least, they're going to have to do two things. Firstly, they're going to have to deal with this immigration issue, which is becoming a major topic in Sweden. And because, Sweden has operated something which is closer than you will find in any other European country to an open door. And it's now becoming a real big issue for many people in Sweden. The second thing is they need to deal with the law and order situation, which, as we've discussed in many programs that we have done on the Duran, the law and order situation in Sweden itself is close to getting out of control in many places. And whereas Sweden used to be one of the safest, most orderly, law-abiding societies, not just in Europe, but in the world, it's now, whole cities are now they've got areas which are out of control. Police don't go there. There's gang fights, there's violence, there's people being killed. There's apparently large numbers of problems with illegal drugs, all kinds of things like that happening. So they've got to get on top of those things, because that's one of the reasons why people have turned to them. They're expecting them to turn and deal with those things. Now, it's widely believed that they are more suspicious of the EU. I'm sure that's true. That they're more suspicious of the US. I'm sure that's also true. That they're less keen on this confrontation with Russia. I'm sure that is also true. But please remember what happened in Austria. And I think that there is a real danger that, events could repeat themselves in Sweden. You had Sebastian Kurz, the Chancellor. He was the leader of the sort of mainstream Conservative Party in Austria. He formed a coalition with this Austrian People's Party, which was, more a bit like the Swedish Democrats in some way. That coalition became targeted for destabilization. There was meetings with Croat actresses who were being represented as Russian oligarchs' nieces. The coalition collapsed. Then there was another scandal, and Kurz himself fell. And I have to say, given how complex any right-wing coalition would be, and given that some of the traditional conservative parties in Sweden must be extremely nervous about the rise of the Swedish Democrats, I would not personally be surprised if any right-wing coalition that was set out now had difficulty establishing itself in the long term. So even if they win, even if they form a government, it's big, it's important, it changes the political direction of Sweden, it is a big event in terms of Europe, but it may not be conclusive, and it could be reversed.
I think actually the tendency now from parties that are rising to power that are coming from say the conservative right or even further right, and I'm specifically thinking about Italy in this case. In Sweden, or possibly in Italy, these parties that look set to get into power they're going to take an approach after seeing what happened in Austria, which is going to be something along the lines of domestically, let's try to fix things, or let's try to fix things our way, the way we campaigned. And on big international foreign policy agenda stuff, let's not rock the boat, because what they did to Kurz and his coalition, they're going to do to us. They're going to target us for destruction, and they're going to set up the nieces of oligarchs and the scandals and their Putin spies and everything that they always do to knock out these coalitions, which are more aligned on the conservative right side of things. So I think even in Italy, we're getting hints that even the brothers, if they do win, Meloni is going to stay the course as far as Ukraine and Russia go, because I think everyone kind of understands, and I would expect the same in Sweden, my own personal opinion. I would expect if the right coalition does end up in power, I would expect them to also come out, and they won't say it, but they'll probably just take a line, something like, yes, we're going to do what we promised to do for our voters inside of Sweden, but as far as Russia, Ukraine, we'll go along with whatever the globalists are telling us to do, because we don't want to take on too many of these forces at once. Look at what they're doing to Orban, for example. They're
absolutely.
going after Orban nonstop.
I think that's entirely correct. Of course, the great problem, I think that, by the way, I'm entirely agree. I mean, that is exactly what I expect with the Italian government, which may form later this autumn. And it's also very likely, in fact, I think it's almost certain that it's what's going to happen in Sweden. The problem is, of course, if you take that approach, it's that whatever you think you may be able to achieve domestically, you find that you can't, because separating the grand strategies of the EU and thinking that you can in that way be left alone to run your own things in your own country, all the evidence is it simply doesn't work. You then find yourself constrained by limited to what you can do, even domestically, by the fact that you're accepting the bigger framework that the EU is imposing on you. Now, I give a very simple example here. Look at Poland. You have a Polish government which is, wanting to pursue a sort of more sovereigntist policies in Poland. It's also taken an extremely pro-EU, pro-West position over Russia, Ukraine. Has it won it any favours? Has it achieved it anything? Absolutely not. There's now a growing pressure on that government from the EU combinat. And of course, they're in a very difficult position. They can't really resist that, because as they're now so heavily involved in this crisis on their eastern borders, they are in a way becoming more dependent on the EU rather than less. So, I mean, you are trying to appease something which is ultimately unappeasable. And they won't thank you for it. They won't like a Swedish government in which the Swedish Democrats have a big role. They won't like an Italian government in which Meloni and the brothers have a big role. They won't cut it any slack simply because it reliably votes for sanctions against Russia over Ukraine. And I think that's something which perhaps some of these parties haven't fully understood.
Yeah, I agree. The EU is all or nothing.
It's all or nothing.
You're either all in. There's no 5% dissension or 10%. There's none of that.
No, absolutely not. The only thing that would really cause them to would cause a shock is if you said to them, "Look, if you're going to mess around with us, we're going to issue an Article 50 request to secede tomorrow." That would, might raise their attention. No European leader has had the courage to do that. In Britain, it didn't happen like that. It was that it needed a referendum that was forced on the government before it happened.
I think they needed two. Was it two referendums,
Yeah, absolutely. Well, of course.
Alexander? Yeah.
No. Yeah.
It took a while. It took
It still
many
took
years.
an enormous amount of trouble. There was an election. There was and of course the entire political class in Britain were horrified. And as I said, so I mean,
They tried to get a second referendum.
They tried to get.
What was the Brexit again?
They tried to get a second
They
referendum.
did one, but they wanted. Yeah, they tried to get a second. Yeah,
Well,
sorry.
which is what they always do. Have the same referendum again and again and again until you get your desired result. That was what they tried in Britain. It didn't work because, as I've discussed many times, the British electorate really doesn't play along with that kind of thing. But in terms of other countries, as I said, there's been no European leader, not even Orban, who's had the political strength and the political courage to actually take on the EU in that way. And until one does, I mean, I think they will continue to be steamrolled.
Yeah. All right. We will end it there, and we'll wait for the results, the final results. The Duran.locals.com and Duran Shop, 10% off. Use the code. Good day.